Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 18th meeting of the Legislative Committee on Bill C30. Today we have a full slate of witnesses, so we'll begin.
For showing up on time, I would request that we pass on to our fellow members of the committee that timeliness is important. We've got a full schedule today. I anticipate we'll probably have to drop off the last two questioners just to get in a little bit of business. We can commence to hear testimony with a quorum of 5. That's what we have, so we are going to proceed. Today we'd like to welcome the Canadian Labour Congress, Marie Clark Walker, Executive Vice President, Andrew Jackson, National Director, Social and Economic Policy, from the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association, Mr. Bliss Baker, Chair, from Iogen Corp, Jeff Passmore, Executive Vice President, from the Office of the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, Mr. Ron Thompson, Interim Commissioner, and Mr. Richard Arsenault, Principal. And by video conference from Vancouver, from Chrysalix Energy Management, Inc., Michael Brown, Chairman, and thank you again, Mr. Brown, for getting up so early out in Vancouver to join us. So, as is customary, we'll give each of the witnesses, just before I proceed to that, for members of the committee, there was a memorandum passed around to you by the clerk, just giving you notice of some of the people that you may want to contact with respect to getting down to clause by clause after we come back from the break. There's phone numbers, contacts there for the Legislative Council, for the Legislative Clerk, and for the Library of Parliament analysts. So some information you'll need for when we proceed after the break. So witnesses, what we typically do is give each of you about 10 minutes, try to keep it to 10 minutes or less because we are fairly full today, to tell us what you would like to tell us about tools and fiscal issues with respect to Bill C30. We're trying to focus on that. And then at the end of all the witnesses, then we go to questioning from the various sides of the room. So we'll start with the Canadian Labour Congress and Marie Clark Walker. The floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to appear on behalf of over 3 million members of the Canadian Labour Congress. Our brief puts forward a Labour perspective on climate change issues which form a major part of Bill C30. It doesn't address all the provisions of the bill, but it does address some. The Labour movement strongly supports effective and concrete measures to avert catastrophic climate change while also building a stronger economy with good jobs. Our environmental and jobs goals should not be in conflict. Good policies can and must address both of these goals at the same time. The science tells us clearly that we must move very quickly to make deep reductions to greenhouse gas emissions if we are to avert a planetary disaster. The costs of inaction far outweigh the costs of action. Dealing with global warming seriously will involve fundamental changes to our carbon-based economy. Major polluting industries, especially the oil and gas industry, have used the threat of economic dislocation and job loss to resist implementation of a real global warming plan. We in the Labour movement reject the idea that there is a fundamental conflict between the economy and jobs on the one hand and environmental sustainability on the other. In fact, dealing seriously with global warming has the potential to create a strong and vibrant economy with many new good jobs. We have a major opportunity to create a better economy, but governments must carefully plan the transition. We should not minimize the scale of the challenges ahead. Some jobs may be lost as others are created. Our climate change policies must therefore include a green industrial policy and just transition policies to create jobs and protect workers and communities. We support inclusion of clear greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets in Bill C30, consistent with our Kyoto commitment, as well as deeper minimum, medium, and long-term reductions. Dealing with global warming will involve major changes in the structure of our economy and society. It's imperative that climate change policy be implemented with and through a Canadian green jobs, green industrial strategy to maximize the creation of good new jobs. Such a strategy will include a mix of regulation, public investment, and direct government support through spending and tax measures for needed new private sector investments. Bill C30 must set the framework by ensuring that the federal government has the power to regulate emissions and product standards as needed, and should also create the legislative framework for an umbrella climate change investment fund. Any new federal revenues from the imposition of charges and taxes to deal with global warming should be credited to the fund, along with a significant portion of existing government revenues. This fund can and should be used to support significant investments by the federal government as well as the provinces and by municipalities. The federal government should work through public agencies and its procurement policies to promote such areas as renewable energy alternatives, energy efficiency, and green transportation technologies. We support the elimination of perverse tax subsidies to the primary oil and gas industries in the next budget, especially the write-off of 100% of capital expenditures for tar sands development. The primary oil and gas sector is highly profitable and can afford to invest much more in carbon reduction measures without special subsidies. We support provisions in Bill C30 to impose hard caps on emissions by large final emitters. The goal must be to force significant real reductions in total emissions, especially in the primary oil and gas sector, not simply a reduction in emissions intensity. An emissions trading system, a responsible one, would be a useful means to lower the total cost of compliance, allowing operations which lower emissions beyond required levels to sell their excess emissions to those who have not. The details of emissions caps will have to be established on a sector-by-sector basis through regulation. Labour should have the opportunity to have direct input to the design of an emissions trading system and the allocation of initial permits. Some industries, such as the pulp and paper sector, have already made major reductions in their use of carbon-based energy by switching to biomass and cogeneration of heat and power, and these efforts should be rewarded through caps which are only modestly below current levels. In regulations implementing a cap-and-trade system, competitive realities, which could cost production and jobs with no environmental gain, will have to be taken into account. In sectors which are closely integrated on a North American basis, significantly raising costs in Canada ahead of the U.S. could cause transfers of production and job loss with no net reduction of carbon emissions. Caps should still be imposed, but at initially modest levels. Emission caps should be accompanied by direct government support for investment in emissions-reducing new technologies and processes by industry, including accelerated write-offs for investment in ineffective environmental technologies. To the extent that energy prices for households increase as a result of climate change measures, low and middle income families should be protected through tax credits which fully offset the extra costs, while still giving everyone an incentive to use energy more efficiently. Utilities could raise prices above a threshold while selling a basic allowance at low cost. The key to just transition for workers affected by changes in employment resulting from transition to a green economy is an aggressive green economic development strategy. Energy-efficient economies are more labour-intensive. This will create jobs and new opportunities for workers. However, there is, as said before, there is a potential for job losses in some sectors which have high carbon dioxide emissions. High energy prices may also compound problems in the wider manufacturing and non-energy-based resource industries such as forestry products. The principle of just transition holds that workers who are displaced or experience wage cuts due to structural economic changes which benefit society as a whole should be fully compensated, as should communities impacted by such changes. The principle has been often expressed in response to trade-driven economic change, but rarely translated into practice. In creating the legislative framework for expenditures to deal with global warming, Bill C30 should establish a Just Transition Fund to be governed by a board, including labour representatives. The fund should be authorized to make payments in support of retraining for workers who lose their jobs due to climate change policies and to compensate workers for any income losses. Communities should also be eligible for support. Provinces must also be encouraged to integrate just transition into climate change plans. In conclusion, Bill C30 must set a clear framework for a national action plan to meet specified greenhouse gas reduction targets, including hard emissions caps for large final emitters and an emission trading system, a framework for new regulatory standards, establishment of mandates for funds to support a green jobs, green industrial strategy, including a climate change investment fund, and funds for just transition. Funding for climate change programs and related tax reforms should also be included in the 2007 budget. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. And thank you for saving us a bit of time there. We'll move to the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association. Mr. Bliss-Baker, the floor is yours for 10 or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of Parliament, for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Bliss Baker. I'm the chair of the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association. I'm joined with my colleague and fellow board member Jeff Passmore, who is also Executive Vice President of Iogen, who will have a few things to say when I conclude. The CRFA, I think without exception, all of you are familiar with the renewable fuels industry, ethanol and biodiesel industry, and the CRFA represents a wide variety of ethanol and biodiesel producers, potential producers, technology providers, and a host of ag commodity groups, all of whom will stand to benefit from an expanded biofuels industry in Canada and from the passage of Bill C30. The CRFA has been around since about 1993 and was started by a group of corn farmers in southwestern Ontario, and since that time we have been advocating and pushing and prodding and lobbying and educating on the benefits and merits of renewable fuels, and we are poised for a significant expansion in biofuels in the coming year or two as a result of the passage of this bill. I have a few comments. I'll try and keep them brief because I prefer to leave some time for questions. But first, let me say that I don't think I'm understating it when I say that the potential for our industry is huge with the proposed renewable fuel standard and the passage of this bill. It means a significant expansion of both biodiesel and ethanol in Canada. And when I say potential, it's because that not all the work is done yet with this bill. There is a significant amount of work that needs to be done, and I'll touch on that in a second. But I think there's little debate within most jurisdictions about the environmental benefits, the agricultural benefits, and the rural economic benefits of expanding a biofuels industry in any jurisdiction. With respect to the environment, there are significant clean air benefits and reduction of CO. There is a significant reduction of particulate matter with the usage of biodiesel, and significant greenhouse gas reductions with the implementation of ethanol and biodiesel into the fuel pool. Secondly, economic development. I think many of you who represent rural communities will know that there are dozens of communities across the country right now that are anxious to see biofuels facilities built in their towns for the simple reason that it will have a huge impact on their local economy. And the vast majority of the resources and money are spent in the community. And any town who's got an ethanol plant in the Midwest U.S. can attest to the fact that their rural economies have expanded significantly as a result of introducing ethanol and biodiesel plants into their town. And thirdly, agricultural benefits, again, are significant. There are three primary benefits. One is on the direct impact of grain prices. In our large facility in Chatham, Ontario, has had a huge impact on the local price of corn, and farmers are benefiting from that. Secondly, it's a great hedge for farmers. When grain prices are very low, and if they've invested in an ethanol or a biodiesel facility, the biodiesel and ethanol plants are making money. And conversely, when grain prices are high, the plants may not be making money, but the farm's making money. So it's a great built-in hedge for the ag sector. And finally, from the government's perspective, if you are increasing revenue to the ag sector through these kinds of value-added propositions, then clearly it means fewer support payments from government to the agricultural sector. So those benefits are undeniable and widely recognized across North America. The 5% renewable fuel standard that is being promoted by the government right now will create a market for about 2.5 billion liters of ethanol and biodiesel. There are many initiatives that the government could support to reduce greenhouse gases today, but there are very few initiatives that the government can support in the transportation sector that are readily available and immediately available to reduce greenhouse gases. And expanding the biofuels sector is one of them. The blending of these fuels into the nation's fuel pool will reduce greenhouse gases by over 4 megatons annually. And this is, will be the equivalent of taking thousands of cars off the road annually. Undoubtedly, today's legislation will achieve this outcome. There's no question about it. The passage of a renewable fuel standard will create a demand for 2.5+ billion liters of biofuels in the marketplace. The question is, for all of us, I suppose, is if we are going to achieve those other benefits, the agricultural benefits and the rural economic benefits, then we have to build these plants here in Canada. And let me just elaborate. We've been, and we're happy to say that the government has consulted with our industry. They've listened to our proposals. We've put a proposal forward that will ensure that plants are built here in Canada. It's a proposal that puts us on a level playing field with the generous tax treatment and regulatory instruments that we see in the United States, where they're launching a new ethanol plant or biodiesel plant every 2 weeks. Our proposal will generate over $2 billion in investment in industry infrastructure, generate thousands of direct and indirect jobs, and provide much-needed value to grains and oilseeds crops across Canada. And, of course, anyone who's living in the GTA right now, or even in parts of Montreal where there's been some refinery outages, and we know that refineries are running at maximum capacity these days, injecting 2.5 billion liters of fuel into the fuel pool at a time when refineries are running at maximum capacity can only have a good impact on the pricing pressures in the marketplace right now. In short, let me just summarize what our proposal is. Many of you are familiar with it because we've met with many of you over the last several months. But in order to achieve some kind of tax parity with U.S. producers and to ensure that we build plants here and make that $2 billion of investment, we have proposed a 10-cent per liter ethanol tax credit program and a 20-cent a liter program for biodiesel. Anything less will put Canadian producers at a serious disadvantage with U.S. producers, and we run the risk of simply importing fuel to satisfy the renewable fuel standard, and the investment that we talked about will end up in the U.S. I know all of you understand that. Again, I'm just to close and pass over to Jeff. We were very pleased with the level of consultation that we had with the government. We know that they certainly heard us, and they understand, I believe now very well, the economics of production in Canada versus the United States. And so we await the federal budget to see the next step of the biofuels policy in Canada.
Mr. Baker, we'll turn to Iogen Corp and Jeff Passmore for 10 minutes, please.
Well, I don't intend to speak for 10 minutes, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And members, it's a pleasure for Iogen Corporation to have the opportunity to appear. I just want to echo the comments made by the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association Chair Bliss Baker and describe briefly cellulose ethanol. Iogen Corporation is in the cellulose ethanol business. Ethanol is ethanol. It's the same molecule. The only unique the unique difference between grain-based ethanol and cellulose is that in the case of grain-based ethanol, of course, it comes from corn or wheat or barley, and in our case, we would not use the corn. We would use the cobs and stalks and leaves, or in the case of wheat or barley, we would use the straw. The other interesting thing about cellulose ethanol is, of course, like grain-based ethanol, it has a very good greenhouse gas emission reduction profile, which, of course, is part of the goal of Bill C30. Iogen is the world leader in this technology. We have a demonstration plant here in Ottawa, right in your backyard. Any of you are welcome to come and have a tour of it. We're the only company in the world who has built a demonstration plant, and this technology has yet to be commercialized anywhere in the world. We're looking forward to getting it commercialized, but there are kind of three legs to that stool. One leg is the technology leg, which we're responsible for. Another leg is the financing leg, and when you do financing, you have equity and debt, and on the equity side, we have our partners Goldman Sachs and Shell ready to provide the equity, and of course we've had a long-term partnership with the Government of Canada supporting our research and development over the last number of years. But on the debt side, the lenders simply don't lend financing to, they don't take technology risks, they don't lend conventional debt to emerging technologies, and hence there's where the role for government comes in. And so Iogen is looking forward to the commercialization of the cellulose ethanol technology. We've had good discussions over the years with a number of country governments, including the Canadian government, and we certainly are looking forward to the implementation and commercialization so that we can deliver both on the greenhouse gas emission reduction benefits and the rural economic development benefits that Bliss spoke about a few minutes ago.
Thank you very much, Mr. Passmore. Appreciate the time. We'll turn to the Office of the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, Mr. Ron Thompson, the Interim Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You've introduced my colleague, Richard Arsenault. I also have with me in the back Mr. Bob Pelland, who can help us if we need them. As you know, the Commissioners Group that I lead conducts performance audits of the implementation of the government's policies and commitments in the area of the environment and sustainable development. In commenting on what has happened in the past, we make recommendations to help point the way to make things better in the future. In all of our work for Parliament, we are strong advocates for sound management of environment and sustainable development by government departments, agencies, and corporations. J'occupe par intérim le poste.
I have been in the post of interim commissioner for about a month, although I have been involved with the commissioners group for some time. Permit me to make an overall observation with respect to an important challenge faced by government in the area of environment and sustainable development.
It seems to me that the task is somehow to encourage and support government officials, frankly, to work as if there was no tomorrow, day in and day out, for weeks, months, and years at a time, to bring about change, much of which only our children and perhaps our grandchildren will see. Now, when you think of it, this is an incredibly difficult but absolutely essential management challenge that must be addressed. And that's where the Commissioners Group can play a significant role. Frankly, we are experts at auditing the quality of environment and sustainable development management and in reporting what we find to Parliament. Our findings and recommendations are carefully crafted to help parliamentarians understand what has happened and what may need to change in the future. Ainsi, en septembre dernier,
For example, last September, after 18 months of detailed audit work in federal departments and agencies, we tabled a report on the management of climate change by the federal government. In a nutshell, we said that Canada was not on track to meet its international obligations to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, that Canada was not prepared to adapt to the effects of climate change, and that the federal government's efforts were not well organized and not well managed. On the positive side, we also said that the government had a foundation to build on. There are several positive programs and practices now in place, and there are many motivated and talented public servants who are committed to success.
we made a series of recommendations to address the deficiencies that we had identified. When we were finalizing our 2006 report on climate change, the current government stated that it had accepted our recommendations and would address them in its climate change approach, the development of which was then underway. As we understand it, the Clean Air Act is seen by the government as an integral component of its climate change plan, which is still being developed. As we have done for the previous government's plans, we will eventually audit the implementation of this new plan once it is in place. De plus, dans nos futurs rapports,
And in future reports to Parliament, we intend to examine the status of actions by the government to address the deficiencies that we have identified and the recommendations that we have made with respect to the management of climate change programs. Mr. Chair, it is my understanding that your committee is also interested in exploring tax system opportunities in relation to Bill C30. We did some work in this area in 2004. Back then, we conducted an audit of the implementation by Finance Canada of 3 commitments it had made in its Sustainable Development Strategy of 2001 on using the tax system to achieve the integration of the economy and the environment.
can have an important influence on the environment directly or indirectly by encouraging environmentally positive activities through, for example, tax credits, and by discouraging environmentally negative activities. As part of the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development Plan of Implementation, the Government of Canada and other countries agreed to pursue certain issues related to fiscal aspects of sustainable development. These could include issues such as restructuring taxation and phasing out harmful subsidies where they exist. Lors de notre vérification de 2004, nous avons constaté que le ministère des Finances avait analysé un certain nombre de questions liées aux engagements en matière fiscale de sa stratégie
During our 2004 audit, we found that Finance Canada had analysed a range of issues associated with the tax-related commitments made in the 2001 Sustainable Development Strategy. However, we found that Finance Canada's approach to implementing these commitments had been piecemeal and fragmented. We also found cases that led us to question whether the department had the appropriate capacity for environmental analysis. Consequently, Finance Canada was not in a position to tell Parliament and Canadians the extent to which it had analysed how the tax system impedes or favours the attainment of sustainable development.
To meet the intent of its 2001 SDS commitments, the Department should conduct a systematic review based on risk of key opportunities for using the tax system to better integrate the economy and the environment. In our view, this would be an important step toward using the tax system as a tool for sustainable development. I'd like to conclude my remarks this morning, Mr. Chair, with two final observations, if I may. First, with respect to commenting on the Clean Air Act directly, our long-standing practice in the Commissioners Group and within the Office of the Auditor General more generally is to avoid commenting on a bill that is before the House of Commons, unless, of course, the bill directly affects the work of our office. And second, my group of 40 dedicated environmental audit professionals is working very hard on a good dozen audits to be reported in October of this year and February of next year. They deal with issues such as toxic substances, pesticides, and contaminated sites. And we have scoped out additional audits and studies that will be slotted into future reports once our consultation process with parliamentarians and others is complete. Monsieur le Président, ma déclaration d'ouverture est maintenant terminée. Nous serons heureux de répondre aux questions des membres dans la mesure où...
We would be very pleased to answer questions that members may have to the extent that we are able.
Final witness, we'd like to turn to Vancouver and Chrysalis Energy Management, Inc., and Mr. Michael Brown, Chairman. Welcome again, Mr. Brown, and the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all this morning. I'll start off by saying I am not an environmentalist. I represent no special interest groups. I'm a capital markets person who has been trying to grasp this issue for more than 20 years and have attempted to keep up personally not only with the science but with economic and social impacts and the way in which capital markets can be expected to respond, especially to changes in fiscal policies. I try to steer a course between worry and realism. I have 5 suggestions, 1 about science and 4 about policy. I believe this country is not prepared for what seems likely to happen. This is reflected in the apparent unwillingness to distinguish between mitigation and adaptation and the difference in fiscal policies which arise from that failure. First, the science, the melting of the permafrost. I believe the Canadian government should instigate a thorough emergency research program into the melting of the permafrost. We usually think of this as being the impact of climate change on the residents of the North. But the other side of the coin has incredible implications. This is the feedback loop of how the melting of the permafrost is and will be liberating hundreds of millions of tons of carbon dioxide and methane. I prepared a chart that's being left with you. It's my attempt to quantify the best research I can find, and as you can readily tell, if my estimates are anywhere near right, we're headed for a greenhouse gas stabilization which is 3.5 to 4 times pre-industrial levels. This is quite stunningly about double other estimates, such as are in Philip Stearns' report to the Government of the United Kingdom, or the most recent IPCC reports, which do not account for this feedback loop. Under this scenario, Canada would be the source of maybe 1/6 of global emissions, not 1/50. These emissions might already be out of control because the faster they happen, the bigger the feedback. I have not put estimates of resulting temperatures in the charts because I can't find any authoritative work, but it would appear most likely that temperature changes and rises in sea level would be much, much greater than the recent IPCC estimates. The outcome of this research will have many implications. First, about 30% of the permafrost is ours. It's our international duty to get the answer to this question. 2, the public expects its leader to tell them all the news, especially the bad news, so we can prepare ourselves for the future. How awful it would be if it turns out the government knows how serious things are but doesn't tell us. 3, if the research I've used is anywhere near right, the global economic damage will be far greater than that estimated by Philip Stern. Canadians will suffer. 4, maybe this will inspire China and India and other developing nations to work more closely with us to avoid a truly huge disaster. 5, it will help Canada where to focus attention and resources. We need to decide whether we should spend our scarce resources on adapting to climate change or trying to slow it down. If I'm right about this, and I'm right about my unconditional skepticism about international treaties, then we should try to understand how to prepare our citizens into living with what's coming. Reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by mid-century would be a cruel target, because it wouldn't be enough to have any positive impact on Canadians then alive. We'll have to learn to live with drought in many places, vastly reduce global food production, with overriding gross changes in the economic well-being of citizens around the world and ours, a very different makeup of the job market, and with new diseases. This implies to me it might be far more important to focus fiscal policy on changes like new genetic improvements for humans, nanotechnology combined with biotechnology to produce new and maybe artificial crops, water conservation and use, much less energy per unit of GDP without sacrificing standards of living, and new adaptations of urban living. 2, economic and social issues. The argument about whether humans are causing climate change is surely over. Now it's time to turn to how much we should be spending, because simply saying, do everything you can, is to ignore fiscal scarcity. Climate change is a transgenerational problem, not unlike the national debt. We have to decide, what, if anything, do we give up when the real cost is squarely on my and your grandchildren? I would request the government fund an independent third party, someone such as the National Roundtable on the Economy and the Environment, to estimate the social and economic cost to Canadians at predetermined intervals of, say, 20 years, from different temperature regimes and depending on the accumulations of greenhouse gases. So, for example, in 2020 or 40 or 60 or 80. The results of the research about emissions from the permafrost must be included. These costs should include estimated impacts on things such as agricultural production, including the impact from reduced water flows from the Canadian Rockies to the prairie grain crops. As the Globe and Mail noted last Saturday, at 40 degrees Celsius, temperatures that are now starting to occur in many areas, heat stress causes photosynthesis to shut down. Making fuel from food is a very short-term proposition. Estimated impacts on fisheries, both ocean and fresh water, especially there are those who now believe our salmon are doomed. Rising sea levels and their impact on real estate values or the cost of dikes. Flora such as forests, whether through heat, dryness, or disease such as the mountain pine beetle. Water for personal and industrial consumption, including the ability to generate electricity from hydro. And manufacturing. For example, will there be a Canadian car manufacturing business in 2060? The effect on people will include population dislocation and decisions about whole sections of a dispossessed society, similar to paying for the loss of fishing income for the Maritimes, but on a massively greater scale. First Nations livelihood from the loss of fauna. Reduced birth rates and increased immigration, especially from nations whose food outputs are under siege. Just about every job in the country. Revenue collection and additional expenditures for federal and provincial governments, meaning less is available for key services such as health care and education. 3, demonstration site. Canada's human emissions make little difference to total greenhouse gas accumulation. After all, Canadians emit less than 2% of global human emissions, which is about the same as the annual increase in emissions from China. So we should be addressing why causing some potential disruption to the Canadian economy will make a difference globally. I believe our attention should be on helping the developing world. If Canada doesn't make the effort, why should they? After all, they argue, and convincingly in my view, it's been our greed and wealth accumulation that has caused the problem. And why should they be restricted from seeking the same standards? China has made it very clear that on the basis of equity alone, it is entitled to ignore its emissions of greenhouse gases. Telling China to cut back on future standards of living is no more likely to succeed there than it would be here. So the question is, how do we help? The implication to me is this. Canada should think of itself as a demonstration site to show two general things. First, that there are systematic approaches which can work, and second, that we can be a place which spends time and money developing new technologies whose feature is enablement of improved greenhouse gas performance at low cost. Many of these technologies can't get to their lowest manufacturing price with the volumes available in the Canadian market, and perhaps not in our traditional markets either. If they are a feature of developing economies, volumes can be sufficient. But using Canada as a demonstration site is useful only if we have a deliberate, proactive dissemination plan. Such a plan ought to include 1. Inviting foreigners to play a role in demonstrations, including those funded by Sustainable Development Technology Canada. 2. Agreeing that the business opportunity is not to sell Canadian goods, but instead to use Canadian technology as a partnering opportunity where we combine forces with developing nations to drive down manufacturing costs. 3. The government guaranteeing intellectual property protection. 4. The government promoting the effective use of the clean development mechanism to recirculate Canadian dollars. 5. Proactively supporting organized industries. So, for example, the Chinese wants our hydrogen and fuel cells to improve fuel efficiency, improve their local air quality, provide an industrial opportunity, and maybe even reduce their greenhouse gases. They don't care what our rationale is. 6. Using the low-cost manufacturing technology overseas for partnered access to third-country markets. And 7, setting up an industrial feedback loop whereby we agree to be the first developed market to buy and deploy the products they make less expensively as part of our own systematic approach to reduce greenhouse gases. The other reason for such a plan is to attract capital, and to that I'll turn next. Capital markets and new technologies. These two subjects are intimately related. First, there are only two ways to influence international behavior, either diplomacy along the lines of Kyoto, and that is demonstrably going to fail because the big countries will not submit to sanctions, or through the actions of capital markets. Capital markets are unsentimental. They care only about winning and not losing. International money, institutional money shifts very fast and is waiting to move where fiscal policy shows it can either benefit or maybe more importantly, avoid losses. It will move to places where it's evident that GHG benign policies are put in place. It will move away if policies continue to encourage industries whose output will not sell. Capital markets are going to be the great rationing card as we scramble to allocate future scarcities. Second, capital markets are enthused about funding new solutions, and they will respond. Conversely, there is no point trying to introduce new technologies unless there is receptivity in capital markets. Sustainable Development Technology Canada plays a great role in pre-market demonstrations. The work it does is unique in the world and must play a role in a comprehensive Canadian policy. The Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development has endorsed its results and especially its governance model. I encourage you to give it more funding. But even for SDDC, profit-oriented capital market uptake is crucial. The same market acceptance filter ought to be imposed on every type of so-called technology fund that the bill mentions. If you introduce underlying fiscal policies which improve the general circumstance for making money out of technology change, entrepreneurs and capital markets will pay attention. In other words, I believe that every fiscal measure you think of introducing should be measured more against the impact on capital markets than against anything else. Fiscally induced changes in behavior are important only if they cause capital markets to pay attention. Send the right signals, capital markets will react.
You'll have to wrap it up,
Mr.
Brown.
Capital markets. Sorry?
Okay, we're over time now. Please wrap it up.
All right. I'm guessing a recent survey indicates that at the mean, Canadians won't pay more than $100 to permanently eliminate climate change. Citizens will not tolerate reductions in their standards of living, which is why those who suggest hair serts and bicycles will not prevail. South Coast Air Quality Management District discovered this more than 20 years ago, and its answer was to focus on forward-looking, I'm now rushing too hard, such as vehicle emission standards. Mark Jacquard loves these. He has an effective explanation in his book. This is what got Ballard funded. Send the right signals, capital will react. I like the idea of increasing the proportion of hydrogen to carbon for all Canadian hydrocarbons delivered to the border or to the refinery. Another plan is tax shifting, where we make deliberate decisions to introduce over time higher and higher new consumption taxes on carbon-based products, offset by reductions in other consumption taxes and corporate and personal income taxes. Assure the public these net changes will be revenue neutral. The key is that people will be able to make choices about where to spend their money and gain economically. Finally, let me commend prizes. For example, you might consider joining up with Sir Richard Branson and doubling his $25 million prize for GHG extraction techniques, but payable by Canada only if Branson's winner's work is done here. Select other far-out radical targets, maybe such as fusion or very deep drilling for geothermal. Don't think for a minute capital markets won't pay attention. Humans are at a crossroad. Future generations will fault our leaders if they do not recognize the importance of the situation. But to say we should do everything we can is a gross oversimplification unless we study better what the impacts will be and when they will occur. Technology is not at fault. Getting the fiscal and regulatory conditions right for capital markets to do their thing is the critical issue now. That, as I see it, is your job.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. We'll move to questions. But before we do, I haven't asked a question in 18 meetings. I'm going to ask a very short one, and it's to Mr. Bliss or Mr. Passmore. I've been told that poppies are an excellent feedstock for biofuel. Do you have any knowledge about that? I don't want a long answer. Just
Did you say poppies?
Poppies.
Poppies.
This is outside the Canadian context, but poppies. No knowledge on that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll move to the 7-minute round. Mr. McGuinty for 7, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to turn, if I could, to the Canadian Labour Congress's brief. And I'd like to congratulate Ms. Clark-Walker for a very good brief. I would like to just confirm a few things, if I could. First of all, just a yes and no would really help me understand your position on this bill. The CLC is affirming its support for the Kyoto Commitment and the Kyoto Protocol. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. You are favorably disposed to Canada participating in the Clean Development Mechanism.
Yes.
Yes. You do believe that it's possible to purchase, as you say, bona fide international credits as provided for in the Kyoto Protocol.
Yes.
Okay. So you don't have challenges on the verification or non-bona fides of these credits. You have confidence in the system as constructed. Is that right?
My understanding is that it's possible to buy credits that are bona fide, not that all credits available are bona fide.
Right. Okay. You agree that Kyoto is a process and that we ought to move to the next phase to bring developing countries, using your words, more fully into the framework in the next phase. And this is a good journey that we're on, a good process that we're on under the Kyoto process, under the UNFCCC. Okay? Can I go to your call for a climate change investment fund? Because today is all about fiscal tools, I'm trying to understand better how this climate change investment fund might work. Your brief doesn't go into too much detail on fiscal issues. You talk a little bit about the accelerated capital cost allowance and the oil sands. You talk about the need to use other fiscal issues, but you don't actually put forward to us here at committee more detailed measures. So could you help us understand how this investment fund would operate in practice?
I mean, we don't speak to these issues in great detail. I think the fundamental point that's being conveyed is if we bring in an emissions cap and trade system, if there's auctioning of permits as part of that, such that there's revenues attached to that system, that those should be recycled into expenditures on climate change mitigation measures. And it did seem to make some sense to have one umbrella fund under which a series of specifically dedicated funds would operate. But I think it's kind of important to have that sense of a loop between revenues from fiscal instruments being expended for the purposes for which those funds are being collected. And in particular, I think dealing with large final emitters, the concept that where it's needed, funding support would be available to help them deal with those caps, which should be at a serious enough level to force real change.
Okay, and we're referring to Mr. Carpelagia for the last 3 3/4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Has your office studied the value for money of 100% write-offs for the development of the oil sands?
No, we haven't. Mr. Krapula, that's getting into the area of, I guess, what we call tax expenditures. We've done some work in that area, mainly trying to encourage the government to publish at least a listing of what these expenditures are. But in terms of looking at the effectiveness of that particular measure, sir, we have not.
And so I imagine you wouldn't, it wouldn't be within your purview to study the effectiveness of tax-deductible transit passes?
What we would do in terms of any program, and that's an example, is our mandate allows us to ask the question, the people who run the program, do they know whether it's effective? Mm-hmm. And if we feel that they don't know or they're not trying to find out, we would comment. Under our mandate, we don't go in and do an evaluation ourselves. It's a peculiarity of our mandate, sir.
Will you be asking, will you be exploring that issue as to whether that decision was a rational economic, environmental decision or whether it was ideology-driven?
Now, you're talking about the bus passes? Or
bus passes.
I wouldn't think so. We would look at the program once put in place to see whether it's being managed reasonably well. We would like to see whether or not, as I mentioned earlier, the people who are running the program know whether it's working. But beyond that, we wouldn't go into.
Well, that would be a good question to answer, to ask actually, whether it's working. I would hope that your office would do that as soon as possible.
Right.
You know, I find it a little. I mean, I'm glad to see you here. You've come to the Environment Committee, but you know, we're talking today about fiscal instruments, and we've just heard from you that you can't, you know, do studies on the value for money of fiscal instruments. So I'm a little perplexed.
If I may comment on that, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
What we've done in the area of fiscal instruments, take the 2004 chapter, sir, that we did, I referred to in my remarks. We looked at what the Department of Finance was doing as it put its tax policy together. And they themselves, the finance officials, said in 2001 in their SDS that they were going to take a good look at the tax system to see in a number of ways. And one of them was to take, we thought, a broad-based look at the tax system to see whether or not there were impediments within it to good integration of the environment and the economy. Now, we called them to account for that, actually, which is part of what we do as auditors in 2004. And we didn't see any evidence that they had done that in a systematic way. And so we reported that in 2004. That's the kind of work we can do on issues like that. And actually, we'll come back and look at that again.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move to Mr. Bigra.
Mr. Bigra, you have 7 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, Mr. Thompson, welcome to our committee. And welcome also to all the witnesses. Mr. Thompson, I believe this is the first time you have actually done any presentation to the Environment Committee since Ms. Jelina was replaced. And I would like to say that your brief is quite timid compared to what Ms. Jelina used to tell us. In paragraph 21, you mentioned that during the 2004 audit, that Finance Canada had analyzed a range of issues associated with the tax-related commitments made in its 2001 Sustainable Development Strategy. Well, Ms. Jelina worded this much more strongly. She drafted a whole chapter, Chapter 3, in 2004. And I'll even tell you what it was called. It was called Greening the Tax System, and Canada is Behind. That's what she said in her title. Now, when I hear what you have to say, that you've done an analysis, and that's all. In her report, she said that the tax system provides enormous potential for tax incentives to protect the environment, and Finance Canada has been a laggard, whereas it should be showing leadership. That's what she said. And within that report, their points were made that pointed us in the right direction. For example, C48 listed several incentives for the oil and gas sector. So I would like you to read that report and read the points that were made in that report, and that shows that the Canadian tax system is far from greening our economy. On the contrary, in fact, what it does is reward polluters. So could you tell us more about that Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 in 2004?
It's a pleasure for me to be here. I picked just a couple of incidents, a couple of recommendations from that chapter because I had 10 minutes to speak this morning. But the chapter itself, as you're quite right, goes into a good deal more detail, and it has 3 basic recommendations in it, that only one of which I picked up. Perhaps I might impose on my colleague, Mr. Arsenault, to go into a little more detail in that chapter. Is that reasonable?
Oui. Vous savez, les stratégies de développement durable, c'est une obligation que les ministères ont de produire ça tous les 3 ans.
SDSs are a commitment that the departments have to live up to. And so that commitment was created for departments, that is, to tell us how they are going to green their operations and their decision-making process. Now, in the case of Finance Canada, what are their business lines?
Key in terms of business lines for Tax Canada. Aussi le budget fédéral.
Also the federal budget. So here we have 2 very important components and issues in this country, and they were told to tell us what their sustainable development strategy was and how they were going to green those components. Now, commitments were made, and those commitments provided for enormous potential, because departments had to analyze their system, and the Finance Canada had to analyze its tax system. Unfortunately, as you pointed out, we realized that the department was dragging its feet. And that hasn't changed. We would say the same today. Now, Mr. Thompson had only 10 minutes to give you a presentation this morning. We did make recommendations to the department. Not only were departments not doing what they committed to do within their sustainable development strategies, but they had been required to undertake those analyses. And we noted that on top of that, that there were shortcomings within their internal strategies. So we made recommendations to the department, and the department more or less ignored what we said to them. All they said was, we're going to continue what we're doing because we haven't been given a clear signal from our political leaders on what they want us to do. So that's the situation we're in today. Do you feel that bills such as Bill C-48 constitute measures that will tackle greenhouse gas emissions? Do you think that those are tax incentives that help us meet our Kyoto obligations? Well, under an environmental assessment, we could perhaps establish links, but that wasn't done. And now I'm saying that the department actually did not do its work, because the Cabinet decided in 1990 that departments will have to do this, these SDSs. And when we undertook our audit, we realized that Finance Canada had not committed to that, had not done it. Now, since then, we've been able to shed some light on the way they function. And there is now a system. We haven't audited that system. We haven't found out whether that system is working. But at the time, it wasn't working. They told us that they had a system, and when we audited it, we realized that there wasn't a system. Thank you. Mr. Baker, could you please provide me with some reassurance here? Ethanol production, yes, can, within a global policy, assist in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but many feel that that production, in fact, has some negative effects. For example, it pollutes rivers, and it can pollute other smaller streams or sources of water. And now there is a production process, and its contribution apparently isn't necessarily as great as some would feel it is. Could you please reassure me and tell me that there is a way of encouraging ethanol production in Canada while providing energy gains and while at the same time minimizing those negative effects that are related to, for example, pollution?
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure what you're getting at in terms of pollution. There are in the production process of ethanol, the emissions are negligible, and when you see a plume from an ethanol plant, it's essentially steam. The wastewater that comes from it.
Are there, I'm talking about perhaps some byproducts that are, or other products that are used, for example, pesticides are required when you're producing corn to produce ethanol.
When you grow corn or you grow any crop, you use herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers. The fact of the matter is that the use of those agents for growing crops has been reduced significantly over the years through policies of government, through land management programs, but also because of the advancement of technologies in nitrogen fertilizers. Those fertilizers have been reduced significantly over the last 10 years, going into growing crops. On a net basis, though, ethanol and biodiesel are renewable fuels that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If there are increased uses of nitrogen in growing corn because you're growing more corn, that's undeniable. That's a fact. But the fact of the matter is the trend is away from using more fertilizers.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Baker. We'll have to move on now to Mr. Cullen for 7, please.
Thank you. A quick question for Mr. Baker to follow up on that. I think essentially we're trying to drive at full life cycle analysis of what it is to use each particular fuel. Are your companies, your agency, willing to subject itself to a comparison between, say, the biofuels and the ethanols being proposed, and a barrel of oil out of the tar sands, and do a GHG comparison in terms of government policy? Let's just make sure we get all our math right.
Yeah, the answer is absolutely. We do it all the time. Our own plants for my company have done life cycle analysis on them recently, and shows that there's a significant impact on the reduction of GHGs on a life cycle basis.
But important to capture it all, not to simply say it's green, it's the perfect solution.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, we're the first to say that ethanol and biodiesel aren't going to solve climate change, and there are some exuberant supporters of our industry out there that overstate the environmental benefits of ethanol all the time.
It's easy to get excited.
It is, but there is a benefit, and that's undeniable.
One last short question. This prospect of the 10 cents a liter for ethanol and 20 for biodiesel, which is being offered in the U.S., why, for heaven's sakes, wouldn't the government offer our government offer a level playing field for production in Canada? Because these plants, as you said, are being built right now, just across the border in many cases.
Right. And the answer is, I don't know. I hope they will. The budget's on March 19th, and we hope.
How critical is this for you in your industry?
It's absolutely critical. The government has proposed a renewable fuel standard of 5% in the gasoline pool, which is great news for us. It's going to create huge demand.
But the real benefit is in the production side, is it not? The real benefit in the actual manufacture of the thing.
Correct. The real benefit is making sure the plants are built here in Canada, and that's what we hope the budget will achieve.
Let's hope so. Ms. Clerk Walker, just in terms of the people that you represent, I think this is something important for the committee to consider. You've talked about a green industrial strategy. You've talked about transition programs. Much of the lightning rod attention has gone into northern Alberta over the oil production, the increase in production there. What are the views of the workers that you represent from that particular region, one that has gotten so much attention, oftentimes so much negative attention around the issue of climate change in Kyoto? What is the position of those workers with respect to Kyoto obligations, to respect to transitioning away from heavy polluting fuels?
I'm going to let Mr. Jackson answer, but I just want to say that we've just gone through a number of task forces and committees with members from that region on those task forces and committees, and all of them are in favor of all of the various green strategies and policies that we've put forth over the years. So I know that
and this includes workers from that region? This
includes workers from Alberta that are in the sector. Canadian, the communication energy paper workers for the most part, and the steel workers.
Yeah, just to add that, I mean, I think a major point of appearing before the committee is simply to make the point when people talk about jobs being at stake here, if we deal seriously with climate change, we think it's important that the voice of workers is heard. Not endorsing that proposition. The Energy Workers Union, Communications, Energy and Paper Workers Union endorsed the Kyoto Protocol, are fully in support of this brief. They'd like to appear before the committee. In fact, they also have a very comprehensive energy policy, and they do represent a lot of workers in the tar sands sector.
It's interesting for us as committee members. We've heard from many witnesses over time, and generally speaking, particularly from industrial witnesses, they will point to another industrial sector and say, well, the problem's over there, not with us. And if you want to fix this, go talk to them, but leave us alone. It's interesting that the people actually involved in the sector are supportive of. I want to get one comment from you, Ms. Clark. You mentioned about a more efficient energy, a more efficient economy is more labor intensive. Can you expand on that a little bit? Or Mr. Jackson?
Well, just to throw out one example, I mean, if we have building codes at a very high level in terms of energy efficiency, effectively you're putting a lot more labor into the construction of buildings up front, and you're saving energy sort of down the road. So you're really effectively displacing a small amount of employment in, for example, power generation, very capital-intensive operations.
Very few workers.
Construction employment. Building retrofits, I mean, is a hugely labor-intensive activity. I mean, there's tens of thousands of construction jobs potentially can be created if we deal with that.
So speaking on the side of employment potential and economic vibrancy, the efforts to honor our Kyoto obligations, from your perspective, representing 3 million workers, is a positive one.
Yeah. And one thing that's very unfortunate, I think looking back, I mean, before we ratified Kyoto, there was quite a bit of modeling done around how to achieve our targets, and implications for employment were studied fairly closely in that period. And, you know, there's really a several years gap gone by since we did a serious sort of matching up of what needs to be done to meet our climate change targets with the employment goals. And I think the point is, on balance, those are positive, but there are pluses and minuses in that equation.
Thank you. A quick question for the interim commissioner. We well know the reluctance of the Ministry of Finance to change any of its policies at all. We've read the reports where the government has declared an intention. You've audited the performance of that intention, you've said they're doing wrong, and then the Ministry of Finance has rejected your audit recommendations. I mean, I've not seen a more stark example. One thing to point out, though, you talked about C30 in your preparation to analyze after it's all said and done as part of a larger government plan. I think it's important for your office to know that government members have been before this committee and held up C30 as the plan. And said, this is it. If you want the Conservatives' plan, if you want the current government's plan for climate change, you're looking at it. So one would throw a line of caution to you as to what you might be studying in the very end, they claim. But in terms of efficacy, because this is important in terms of how government spends its money, there is a program rolled out earlier last year that cost $2,000 a ton for government to reduce GHGs per ton of greenhouse gas emissions. From your past analysis, from the Commissioner of the Environment's past analysis on what a per ton acceptability in government policy has been, is at $2,000, is this a safe or a credible marker for Canada to initiate our efforts to reducing our own GHGs?
Quick answer, please.
Quick answer is I don't know. All I can suggest, do you have any comments on that, Richard?
We have not tried to do that exercise because in some cases programs may not generate a lot of reductions on the short term, but they are aimed to having an impact on society and generate further reductions on the longer term. So how do you calculate a per ton value? It's a very difficult exercise.
Okay, I think the answer is we don't know. So we'll have to move on. I'll just remind folks that we do have a witness in Vancouver as well. Mr. Warrower. I'm sorry, Mr. Watson for 7, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing here before the committee. I certainly appreciate you lending your insights to us as we examine C30, Canada's Clean Air Act. We have heard, as you well know, from many witnesses over the last few weeks. I can assure you our government is committed not just for today but for the long term to tackling the issues of greenhouse gas and pollution reduction for all Canadians. Your efforts will help us in that regard. I know many of my colleagues will be asking questions of all of you. I'd like to begin by focusing my questions, though, for the moment on toward the Ms. Clark-Walker and Mr. Jackson with the Canadian Labour Congress. I just want to ask initially, just to lay some groundwork here, your Kyoto position, your pro-Kyoto position, when did your organization adopt that? What year?
Well, I don't know exactly when we first took that position, but certainly we appeared before this committee before Parliament ratified the Accord in support of the Accord.
Has that position been reviewed or updated since then, and when did you do that review or updating of your position?
Well, when we were writing this brief at the last meeting of our committee, I mean, I think we're well aware that time has passed since we ratified and that our emissions have been rising since. I think our brief is clear that for us, staying with our Kyoto commitment could possibly involve purchase of international credits. So clearly time has moved on since the time of ratification.
This committee will be we'll be hearing a number of amendments when we reconvene at the end of March. One of them could be, of course, literally putting in writing in C30 that the short-term target and timeline for the government to meet its Kyoto objectives could be actually put in there. Should the short-term target and timeline for Kyoto be enshrined in C30? In your opinion?
Yes, I mean, but I'm not totally sure on the question. I think, just to repeat myself, I think it is. I mean, we need to make a determined effort to meet that actual emissions target as rapidly as possible.
I'm not asking
to my mind, sort of staying true to the Kyoto commitment.
I'm asking specifically, should the target and the timeline be put in? I mean, as opposed to making a determined effort in that direction. Those could be two very different things.
I'm unclear whether when you say the timeline includes purchase of international credits to make up for any possible shortfall, or you're legislating the actual emissions level.
I'm asking whether 6% below our 1990 commitment should be articulated as the specific short-term target and timeline in C30.
Yes.
Okay. I appreciate, Mr. Jackson, you've said that you want to ensure the voice of workers is heard in this discussion. Is the Canadian Auto Workers a member of the CLC? Very good. Mr. Hargrove, in fact, appeared before this committee. I'm going to quote Mr. Hargrove. He said, quote, "It would be devastating for the whole community, anybody that signed on to Kyoto," he said. "It's not even a remote possibility. No Prime Minister in any one of the parties in the House of Commons is going to bring in any kind of regulation that says we have to do that. It would be suicidal for our economy." He goes on to say, if somebody were to come out tomorrow and say you have to reach the objective that was laid out initially immediately, you'd almost have to shut down every major industry in the country, from oil and gas to the airlines to the auto industry, and that just doesn't make sense, unquote. Do you agree with Mr. Hargrove's comments?
Again, I don't have the context for those comments. I don't have anything in front of me that says what else he said, other than what you're indicating. What I can say to you is that the CAW sits on all of our committees and have been very, very clear in their commitment to Kyoto, have been very, very clear in their support for all the Canadian Labour Congress briefs. And I mean, they have a position on fuel efficiency and reduction of emissions around the auto industry, and it's been very, very clear, and it's included in our brief as well. So without the full context of his comments, I can't comment on what he said.
Well, I encourage you to go back and read the transcripts. He was referring specifically to the current Kyoto deadline, both in target and timeline. Did the CLC do its own analysis of Kyoto's impact on the economy, or did you rely on someone else's analysis for impacts? And if so, when did you do that analysis?
When the CLC supported ratification of Kyoto, it was, I believe, if you went back to a brief, we relied a lot on the analysis that was done at the time by Infometrica around the economic and employment impacts.
Have you reviewed or updated analysis on impact to the economy, and if so, when did you do that?
Not in any similarly.
Not since pre-1997. Okay. Can you tell us then if we keep
not in a similarly systematic way. I mean,
Fair enough. Well, then can you tell us which sectors will be impacted by job loss, to what degree, if in the next 4 years, if we try to meet the Kyoto target and timeline?
Well, I think it's impossible to answer that question, because it depends on what policies would be adopted to rapidly as possible. I mean, I could give you a few examples where I think emissions could be reduced quite substantially.
Can I give you maybe a more specific question that might help that one?
I'm just answering your question.
Okay,
I mean, if we take fugitive gas emissions, for example, from the oil and gas sector, I mean, I think that's generally considered to be low-hanging fruit in terms of large emissions reductions that could be achieved fairly quickly.
Fair enough. Ms. Clark-Walker, in your presentation you said that modest initial emissions caps, so no production transfer to other countries without domestic environment benefit occurs. How do you square that with the Kyoto target and timeline? I mean, who will have to cut emissions under your scenario? How would you meet that target? Would that be by credits? Fair enough question.
Just to be very clear,
they're your words, not mine. So,
I think we do recognize that given the fact that emissions have increased very, very significantly since we ratified Kyoto, that in all probability, to meet our Kyoto commitment, we will have to purchase international credits. I believe to be the case, based on evidence that's being presented to this committee, that there are bona fide international credits that can be purchased from the point of view of the global environment, whether those emissions actually take place in Canada or in a bona fide way elsewhere, is essentially irrelevant. So we can meet our Kyoto commitment while through that mechanism.
fair enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Mr. Holland for 5, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. A good start, if I could, with Mr. Baker. I'm concerned right now with the fact that recently Canada has been importing ethanol from Brazil, and we're subsidizing that, which seems preposterous to me, particularly when the advantages of utilizing domestic ethanol are so clear. I'm wondering if you can talk to me a little bit about that and what actions you think the government needs to take to arrest that, to stop it.
All right, thanks for the question. You're right. Under the current tax regime, there's a federal excise tax exemption on ethanol in Canada. That tax exemption applies equally to all ethanol, whether it's Brazilian, American, Canadian, because the tax code cannot discriminate under international trade laws. We have proposed to the federal government that they repeal that excise tax exemption and replace it with a domestic-only support program or tax credit program that is trade compliant, but that applies to domestic ethanol only, and thereby would stop the subsidy of imports.
Thank you. One of the problems we're obviously going to have with biofuels, aside from the production side and ensuring that we have adequate domestic production to meet demand, is also being able to retail it, being able to have places to which to retail it. Do you have any specific recommendations on how we should, on what policies we should have? I know that Sweden, as an example, made it mandatory that there was a biofuel option at every station. I mean, what should Canada be looking at ensuring that consumers have that choice when they go to the pumps?
Our advice to the government and our recommendation to anyone is that the renewable fuels mandate, if you will, should be flexible. If oil companies are required to contain 5% ethanol in their gasoline, then it should be up to them and the marketplace to determine where they put that ethanol. As long as there's 5%, then we're indifferent. We think the market should decide where it goes.
Okay. To Mr. Passmore, if I could. First, I know that you had been seeking with Iogen for some period of time to build a plant in Canada. There was a recent announcement that the American government was giving, I believe, $80 million, and now that you'll be building a plant in the United States. Can you talk about, I guess, your thoughts on the things the Canadian government needs to be doing to encourage the development of cellulosic ethanol, or to help companies like yours in developing capacity domestically as opposed to losing it to other countries?
Well, first of all, what was announced yesterday in Washington was an invitation to commence negotiations with the U.S. Department of Energy. It was not an award of funds. It was an announcement that they intend to start discussions for an award of up to $80 million U.S. So that whole process will, unfold as it will over the next few months. It does not guarantee that we would build a plant in the U.S. The grant money that is being proposed is going towards the project that we are proposing to build there, but you still need to cover the debt financing component of the facility, and in that case, the instrument that the U.S. government has chosen to use is a loan guarantee. To the extent that we are talking here about tax policy, there's the federal government doesn't have a lot of levers at its disposal, but one of the strongest levers it has is tax policy. And we've had discussions for many years with the Canadian government looking at a combination of economic instruments. They could be loans, they could be grants, they could be loan guarantees, whatever, or any combination of the above. Certainly we've had a lot of support from the Canadian government with respect to cost-shared R&D and repayable contributions through the Technology Partnerships Canada program, but the Department of Finance has decided in their wisdom that loan guarantees are not an economic instrument that this government wishes to use. At least that's been their position so far. The German government, which is another country where we're looking at building a facility, loan guarantees are just a common way of doing business to encourage emerging technologies. In fact, there's such a common way of doing business in Germany that PricewaterhouseCoopers has a standing contract with the government of Germany to manage their loan guarantee program for emerging technologies. The U.S. government is kind of halfway in between Canada and Germany. It does not have a standing program, but it instituted in legislation in August 2005 a loan guarantee program to cover the technology risks associated with emerging technologies. So not just cellulose ethanol, but the next generation of nuclear and something called coal to liquids and so on. So we continue to have discussions, quite positive ones, with the Canadian government, and with respect to the coming budget, we would hope to see some initiatives put in place for the commercialization of cellulose ethanol in Canada.
And just to emphasize the fact that loan guarantees are something that you think is an important tool the government should be considering using.
Absolutely. I mean, basically, the fundamental, if you're looking at doing a project financing with a combination of equity and debt, I have a project finance Bible on my desk, and there's a chapter in there that says no new technology. If you're a lender, do not take technology risk, because you'll go beyond a normal financing risk, and so you do not lend to new technology unless that debt is guaranteed by a strong credit rating such as the government. So that's one instrument the Canadian government could use. If they choose instead to use a combination of other instruments such as grants or loans, that's fine. Just a very quick follow-up, by the way, and I'm sorry, Mark, if I'm not answering your question, but the comment that question that Member Cullen asked, and follow up to Bliss, with respect to the life cycle analysis of cellulose ethanol, it's a very positive net energy balance in the greenhouse gas emission reductions based on studies done by reputable U.S. government labs like the Argonne National Lab in Chicago, for example. Look at the GHG emission reductions from cellulose ethanol in the 80 to 90 to, in some studies, up to 100% range.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to Mr. Warrower for 5, please.
Thank you, Chair. 5 minutes is not enough, but that's all I've got. Just a very quick comment. I appreciate Mr. Jackson's comments on carbon credits. Some of the witnesses that have been before this committee, for example, Professor Boyd from UBC, Professor Mark Jacquard from Simon Fraser, I'm quite sure you're aware of them, Ms. Donnelly from the West Coast. The common theme that we've heard is about carbon credits is, I'll just quote Mr. Jacquard, buying credits is an option often discussed but little understood, Mr. Jacquard said. Buying international credits is in a 4-year term frame. It's virtually impossible because you have to buy it from someone. Someone somewhere has to have done some greenhouse gas reductions, and we have to be able to verify that they did that. That is really difficult, he said. So that was the theme. But I don't want to go down that path. We all basically need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and this government is committed to doing that. I want to ask Mr. Passmore questions about the cellulose ethanol. I had a tour, very impressed with the demonstration facility that we have here in Ottawa, and very optimistic that that is a technology that will dramatically help us to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and provide cleaner fuels by using basically a waste stock. You had these giant bales that you would pulverize the straw, and then you, through an enzyme, create alcohol, like a big still. You would then add gasoline to come up with 85% alcohol and 15% gasoline to create what was called ethanol, E85. Am I understanding that correctly? And could you just, for the benefit of maybe people that are watching today, just to understand how the technology works, what can you use for a stock? You were using straw at Iogen right now. What other type of stock can you use? Grasses, wood, what can you use to create ethanol?
Thank you very much for the question. Let me just start off by saying that ethanol is ethanol. So the molecule that we make at Iogen using cellulose is the same molecule that Mr. Baker makes using grain. Ethanol is ethanol. But you're right. Our ethanol comes from various feedstocks that are high in cellulose content. But we can use any number of grasses. In Canada, if you were building a plant in Ontario, you'd be using corn cobs and stalks and leaves because we grow a lot of corn in southwestern Ontario. In the prairies, in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, you'd be using cereal straws. So we grow a lot of wheat and barley in western Canada, so we would use the straw from the wheat and barley. But we can also use things like switchgrass, which is a native prairie grass that grew back in the days when the buffalo roamed. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture has identified switchgrass as a dedicated grass that it would like to see farmers start to grow as an energy crop on land that they're not currently growing crops, or on land where the is marginal land that they could actually grow an energy crop such as a native prairie grass. And your description of the process is correct. I mean, we bring in these big bales of straw and we add enzymes. Enzymes are no different than the saliva in our mouths that helps us digest food and starts to break it down the minute we put food in our mouths. Well, these enzymes attack the cellulose and convert that cellulose into glucose. Glucose is just sugar, so you ferment it and distill it to make alcohol. It doesn't have to be used in an E85. I mean, right across the country, and this is a little bit to the question that Member Holland asked, E10 blends can be used, by all cars today. All car manufacturers warrant up to the blending of 10% ethanol, and it goes seamlessly into the existing infrastructure. The E85s that you talk about, which are 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline, we have a fleet of vehicles at Iogen that run on cellulose E85. These are called flexible fuel vehicles. They exist because of U.S. law, not because of Canadian law. The U.S. CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy, require that across your vehicle fleet. If you're an automotive manufacturer, you've got to have a minimum, I think it's, I forget if it's 28 miles to the gallon. Well, if everybody was buying Geo Metros, that would be easy, but if everybody's buying SUVs, it's hard to meet those mileage standards, but you get a credit against your CAFE standards for alternate fueled vehicles. And so if you can run a vehicle on 85% ethanol, so Chrysler makes them, Ford makes them, General Motors makes them, there's about, I can't remember, 6 or 8 million of them on the road in the U.S. today, and we have a fleet of E85s. I've been running my Chevy Impala on cellulose E85 for the last 2.5 years.
To cut it off there, and I'd like to remind witnesses and members alike that the issue today is fiscal issues, tools. So we'll turn to Monsieur Lucier for 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Lucier, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll deal with fiscal issues immediately. Mr. Thompson and Mr. Arsenault, in paragraph 20 of your presentation, you mention that in the development plan of implementation, there were fiscal aspects. And on the last line, you mentioned that there were harmful subsidies. Have you had an opportunity to look at the SDSs of departments and to identify those harmful subsidies?
Mr. Lucier, we're doing quite an intensive audit on a number of these SDSs just now for reporting in the fall. In terms of looking at the harmful subsidies, I'm not aware that we've found them in there yet, but I've only looked at this current year's. Perhaps Mr. Arsenault would know a little bit more.
Même chose ici, faut dire que c'est assez décevant lorsqu'on regarde les stratégies de développement durable des ministères.
Décevant.
It can be quite disappointing to look at the sustainable development strategies of departments because we expected to see strategic documents that would tell us what direction they were headed in, because this is a long-term commitment. However, departments took rather weak commitments, made rather weak commitments, and that didn't seem to line up with their business plans, because the department has to deliver a certain type of merchandise, let's say, and their strategies didn't line up with that. Now, we want to make sure, and we want to understand whether the higher levels of the department really understand those strategies and are committed to them. Now, at that World Summit, commitments were made by Canada and by other countries, and therefore we would have expected to see an action plan. Thank you. That answers my question. Ms. Clark, did I understand you well when you said that workers should have access to carbon credits? How would they do that?
I don't think I said workers should have access to carbon credits. I was saying that's one of the things that we could use to offset. I've just lost my train of thought, sorry. Yeah, if we exceeded our emissions, that's one of the things that we could use, and that was around the carbon trading mechanisms.
Okay. Maintenant, vous avez bien mentionné que les travailleurs.
Thank you. You said that workers should have access to green plans.
The point we were making is if we bring in a sort of cap and trade system for large industrial emitters, I have no real idea sitting here right now how that would be played out in terms of specific industrial sectors. I mean, there were prior discussions. We think it's important that workers in those industries should have some voice in the design of that system as it's rolled out. The example we use in the brief is, to our knowledge, if you take the pulp and paper sector, for example, there have been large reductions in emissions by shifting to biomass. So it would probably be appropriate in setting caps in that sector to recognize that large emissions reductions have already been received, rather than just a cookie-cutter solution across all sectors. So what we're saying is that if there's a sector-by-sector approach, there should be some provision for labour input into that. As in fairness was the case under the previous government, there were some consultations with labour around the design of the system.
Merci. Mr. Baker? Vous avez mentionné deux incitatifs fiscaux. J'en ai manqué un, 20 sous le litre. Le deuxième, c'était quoi? Et l'incitatif fiscal devrait-il aller aux producteurs?
You mentioned two types of incentives. And one was a 20-cent per liter one, and then another one. Could you tell me what that other one was, please?
The other one, there's one for ethanol and one for biodiesel.
Okay.
10 for ethanol and 20 for biodiesel. And that's what we had proposed was a refundable tax credit program.
Et est-ce que ça doit aller aux producteurs?
And should that go to agricultural producers, or should it go to the ethanol or biodiesel producers? The subsidy, that is.
We've suggested that go directly to the ethanol and biodiesel producers. Mm-hmm. But clearly there's going to be a spin-off benefit to the ag sector. In our project, we have hundreds of farmers who have invested in those projects who will benefit from those.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Mr. Jean for 5, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses that came today. Very much appreciated. I have a couple of comments at first. Ms. Clark-Walker, I'm from Fort McMurray, and I found it interesting that you had such a vast amount of support from that area for Kyoto. And I'm wondering, do you have any copies of letters, or have you received a lot of letters from people in northern Alberta being in support of Kyoto?
We haven't received the letters of people in support. We represent as I said, the CEP workers, the steel workers that are out there, the IBEW workers that are out in the tar sands, and they all took part in helping us prepare this brief. They're all in support of our policies.
I understand. I just was curious because I've lived there for 40 years, and I know the workers. I have brothers that are in the unions. I myself worked in a union for a period of time up in that area, and I just found it very surprising because I had 7 letters in support of Kyoto, and I actively campaigned that Kyoto was impossible to meet the targets. And I got 65% of the vote, 18th highest in the country. And I just found it very surprising that you had such support from that area, because quite frankly, I could sum up, and I'm going to just read into the record, just sum up what our opinion is in relation to the Kyoto targets and meeting them. And this is from Laurie Goldstein in this morning's Ottawa Sun on Dion's top 10 Kyoto excuses, and he says, since in the real world, as opposed to liberal la-la land, many believe Dion's position is, how should I put this delicately? Oh yeah, insane. I just want to make sure that's to the record, because most people up there, quite frankly, find it laughable. Kyoto is impossible to meet without buying international credits for certain. And that's my first line of questioning. We've heard from a lot of experts that suggest that the cost to meet Kyoto, not just on domestic action, but for buying international credits, would be somewhat up to the range of $38 billion. And $38 billion over a 4 or 5 year period would cost each taxpayer in this country, if probably about somewhere in the range of $3,300 to $3,600 over that 5 year period. And we heard from Mr. Brown that indeed Canadians won't tolerate more than a $100 cost of implementing Kyoto. Is that correct, Mr. Brown?
That was the result of a survey that was published about 3 weeks ago. I believe it was an Ipsos Reid survey.
So what do you think if there's 2 taxpayers per household in Canada, each household would be responsible for $6,600 over a 5 year period? What do you think Canadians would think about that?
I don't think they'd like it one little bit. But I think the issue is, I'm not sure that Canadians understand what the long-term impact is on their children and their grandchildren if we let this thing carry on without making some concerted effort. So one of the reasons I have one of the suggestions is to try and figure out what that looks like, and then work it backwards. It's a little, as I said, like the national debt. Let's see if we can figure out what not doing anything is going to cost our heirs. I've got 9 grandchildren, and some of them are going to have kids within 10 years. I'm an old guy. And I want to know what sort of cost are we imposing on them. If we can understand that, and if we could publicize the results of some surveys and work that's done by third parties, such as the National Roundtable, the economy and the environment, then maybe we could come up with better ways to decide how much to spend now.
Mr. Brown, I think that's very wise. Indeed, I think that most Canadians would agree that we need to do something. It's just how we implement it and how we spend our money and how effective we are. And that's what this Act is all about, trying to find a way to clean up our own backyard before we worry about everybody else's. But
could I say something about that? The fact is, the bang for the buck is way greater if we help China or India reduce their emissions than if we do anything about ours. But there's nothing that I see in this bill that suggests that that would be a good idea.
But wouldn't you agree that indeed we have to remain competitive at the same time as we help them, and the best way to help them is by providing them with technology that is made at home here and that has actually proven results?
I think that that's a great way to go, because the Chinese, and I'm not sure about the Indians, but I do know about the Chinese because I spent quite a bit of time trying to understand it, and I've been there many times on this subject. The Chinese have made it very clear. They don't believe they have any obligation to reduce their greenhouse gases. So one of the things that we have to do is encourage them to do that some way. And if we can if we can disseminate our technology there in an effective manner, that helps a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. I just want to turn, I've got one more question. I'd like to put this towards our green fuel people. What is going to be the net effect to our farm communities across Canada? I mean, we've got a supply management system that causes us to subsidize, quite frankly, farmers because we want to make sure we have a secure, safe source for food in Canada, and it's very, very important to all of us. But what is going to be the net effect on the long-term basis if we go towards the 5% renewable and then continue on that vein with your technology?
It's hard to put it to be brief, it's hard to put a pin in exactly what the dollar value is, but there's going to be an impact on grain prices locally, particularly in the local region. There will be a boost to local grain prices, which means new revenue for farmers. There will also be an impact on the stability of commodity pricing, which gives stability to the farm. Net new revenue to the farm means fewer payouts from the government to support programs.
So it'd be better for taxpayers long term if we go towards this initiative that the government's doing right now?
No question about it.
Very quickly, $20 million, the plant we're proposing to build in Saskatchewan, $20 million a year in straw purchases alone. That's not the jobs in the plant or the trucking jobs or anything like that. That's just paying for the straw.
Sorry, we're going to have to move on to Mr. Godfrey for 5, please.
Yes, I want to pick up, this is a question which is directed both to Mr. Brown and to Mr. Jackson and Ms. Clark-Walker. In your proposal from the CLC, you refer to the large final emitters, and you refer to Pembina, and you refer to pricing carbon at $30 a ton for large final emitters. And you say this would force real change without undue disruption and dislocation. I'm wondering, both from the Canadian Labour Congress and from Mr. Brown, whether you've got any further analysis that would confirm that that is the sweet spot between forcing change and causing economic disruption, or whether this is, you've just gone as far as Pembina. And maybe Mr. Brown has some independent information at what, I mean, because you're asking, we're looking at fiscal tools. One of them, clearly, this needs a price incentive to get people moving, and whether that's the right kind of zone for a price signal.
The short answer to that is basically what we're saying is based on the work of the Pembina Institute, and to our mind it's not the end of the world if we have a slower pace of tar sands development. Can I just since I've got, I just did want to clarify one point about what we were saying earlier. It is my understanding that under Kyoto we are committed to do a combination of 3 things, not 2 things. One is to reduce our emissions. The second is we can use the clean development mechanism. Or the third thing is we can take on an additional obligation in the subsequent period. So it's not just an either or in terms of reductions or purchasing credits.
Mr. Brown.
I haven't done any specific analysis on what the right price ought to be for carbon. I do believe that it's appropriate that in line with things like forward-looking regulations, it would make sense to increase prices over time, tell people in advance what they're likely to be. I don't think that it's appropriate to set a price for carbon until we understand what the damage is that's likely to be done by a ton of carbon. That gets me back to the notion that I'm not sure we understand what these long-term damages are going to be. If my presumptions about the release of methane from the permafrost are real, I'm going to suggest to you that the damages are going to be intense. I mean, if IPCC estimates up to 4.5 degrees centigrade in changes, and there's an article in the New Scientist from 2 weeks ago that indicates that IPCC work did not include some of the commonly discussed material amongst scientists, including this feedback loop, then we could be looking at global temperature increases substantially above 4.5 degrees by the end of the century. This would have dramatic impact on things like food production, fish production, rising sea levels, and so forth within the lifetime of my grandchildren. And until we know the answer to that, I don't know how we price the value of getting rid of a ton of carbon today.
But I would gather from your presentation that you're urging us to get on with it. You're not asking us to wait around until we know the answer to the question to start moving on pricing carbon. Would that be correct? I mean, that we've got to, we can't wait for the full analysis.
I think that getting on with some legislation that indicates that we're going to start a carbon trading and penalties program based on general caps is a very good idea. I'm not sure that we should start at prices any higher than are evident in Europe, but I think we should make it clear that over time analysis will be done that's going to suggest increasingly higher prices over time. And I think you will find that capital markets will respond very positively to that sort of a program.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll move back to the government side for 5 minutes to Mr. Manning. Thank you.
Thank you.
And sorry, this will be the last question because we have some business to conduct at the end of this.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome our guests here and thank them for their presentations. Question, if I could, to Mr. Jackson or Mrs. Clark-Walker. Correct me if I'm wrong. In your presentation, you made a comment concerning the Climate Change Investment Fund. Would that be correct? a fund to compensate workers and communities who would lose their jobs and economic activity due to meeting some of our targets. I'm wondering, have you costed that endeavour? Can you give us some estimate on what that will cost for a compensation package to address those concerns?
I think you're referring to our proposed Just Transition fund, but in any case, the answer is we haven't costed it, and nor could you cost it until we have an actual climate change plan that we could do an analysis of.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't think it would be a huge cost.
Okay, if I could go to Mr. Thompson, please. Find it here now in a second. Back in your presentation, as we all know, we adopted the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and you carried out finished up a report, I would say, in September of 2006, looking back over those almost 10 years. And just to quote you for a moment, in a nutshell, you said that Canada was not on track to meet its international obligations to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, that Canada was not prepared to adapt the effects of climate change, and that the federal government's efforts were not well organised and not well managed. Follow on down to paragraph 13. In your report, we made a series of recommendations to address the deficiencies we had identified. I wonder if you could put forward today, if possible, some of the recommendations that you think should be part of Bill C30. If there's some of those recommendations should be part of the bill, or just policy directives off to the side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could comment just briefly on that. I'm not going to try to explain what should be in C30. Let me take another cut at that, though. In a climate change plan, a plan to address the climate change issue, we believe very, very strongly, and this was in the report last fall, that there's a need to have clear, measurable expectations or targets for both the short, medium, and longer term. Otherwise, there's no way of knowing, really, whether the plan is unfolding as it should, whether activities being carried out during the year or over a period of 2 or 3 years are actually working or not. So you need expectations, you need targets, and you need them for those 3 time frames, I would suggest. Now, the other thing that I would suggest would be important to have in addressing climate change is to take those targets and to capture them in what I'd call a concise periodic report from time to time to parliamentarians, so that they would know in plain language whether in fact the program that is being worked on, and it's a long-term program, is having any effect. And I firmly believe that kind of a report is possible to prepare. In fact, we have a little bit of work that we're going to do next spring to take a look at that. But that's the key to it all, I think, sir. The clear, measurable expectations or targets, get them firmly in place so everyone can see them for the short, medium, and longer term, and then report back on those periodically. That needn't be annually. It may be every 3 years or something. So all of us could know, primarily members of Parliament, but the Canadian people too, whether or not the initiatives that we're taking on are working.
So you think that should be part of the legislation?
I think it should be part of a plan. Whether it should be part of this legislation, I don't know. And the reason I'm being a little evasive on that, there is C30, but then there was also published not too long ago a notice of intent to develop and implement regulations and other measures to reduce air emissions. And this is a document, I think, that came out of Environment Canada. So there's a little bit more to what I would call a plan, I guess, Mr. Cullen, than perhaps C30. And that's why I was suggesting that maybe the plan that will eventually unfold isn't quite here yet. But in terms of the plan, if I can put it that way, whether it's in C30 or someplace else, I think these two things should be part of it.
Do you care to comment, Mr. Arsenault?
Well, what I could add is the fact that when we look at the way things were being implemented prior to proposals that are in front of us, we said that there were major problems with governance and accountability. Climate change is an horizontal file. It involves a number of departments. They have to work together. And what we found back then is that there were problems. Problems because leadership was switching from one department to the other from time to time. There were some structure that were put in place, like the Climate Change Secretariat, that was doing good work, but was dismantled without being replaced. Then the central agencies got involved, but they said, we're not the owner of this, we're only helping. So there were issues with that. Now, there was a program review that was started under the former government and was complete under the current government, and the information from this, I'm sure, would inform the government in terms of what exactly it wants to do with these programs. And these programs are managed by a series of different departments, and therefore, the basics of good government, good management is get your accountabilities in shape. And then, as Mr. Thompson said, it's very important that we have clear targets, clear performance expectations, and that we report on our progress. Now, things are not going to be perfect from day one, but once we know, we can make adjustments. The government can make adjustments.
Okay.
Parliament can help the government.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to cut it off there. And we'll make that the last question here because we have a little bit of committee business to do before we adjourn. I want to thank all of the witnesses for joining us. Mr. Brown from Vancouver, particularly, it's time for your Starbucks latte or whatever. And the witnesses who joined us personally, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. I'd like us to give them a verbal handshake, if you don't mind, so that we can stay behind here and do the business of the committee. So a firm verbal handshake, and thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, folks, we've got a couple things to deal with. We've got a notice of motion, and then I will have some guidance for the committee after we have disposed of the notice of motion, depending on which way that motion proceeds. So, Mr. Cullen, I believe you have a motion to propose.
I appreciate your adaptation and modification of committee business to the virtual handshake. It's very interesting. So the main issue that's brought forward in this motion today is committee members can read it, and I can read it out into the record, that all instructions for amendments be submitted to the Legislative Council for drafting by 9 a.m. March 8th, that amendments be given to the clerk of the committee no later than 9 a.m. on March 9th, 2007, that the clause-by-clause study begin 9 a.m. on March 12th, that at 5 p.m. on March 22nd, 2007, all remaining questions on the bill be put without further debate, that the report on the bill be presented to the House on March 26th, 2007. The intention for this motion and the reason behind it is that witness after witness, and again today, have urged us to act with urgency. And time again, I've put motions forward to this committee to offer paths forward for urgency, and I will continue to modify them. But as we've now had a budget date presented, and we have the prospect of some, who knows, election on the horizon, establishing what it is that all the parties around the table want to get done when it comes to climate change is of great imperative prior to any confidence motions and any budget votes. This is a motion that allows us to present our best ideas on the table, have a vigorous and decent debate, and we're prepared to do as many meetings as possible for a good debate, and then vote on them and present it back to the House in due course. So that's the motion, and I present it to the committee. I move it.
Okay, thank you. Do we have discussion on the motion? We'll move directly to the question. All those in recorded vote?
The question is on the motion. Do I need to reread it or dispense?
Dispense.
Mr. Cullen? Mr. Jean? Mr. Manning?
Against.
Mr. Paradis?
Contre.
Mr. Warrow? Mr. Watson?
Contre.
Mr. Godfrey?
No.
Mr. Holland?
No.
Mr. McGuinty?
No.
Monsieur Bigrat?
No.
No.
That motion is defeated. I'd like to just provide a little bit of guidance then for further conduct of the business of the committee. On January 29th, 2007, the committee adopted the following work plan: that the committee hear witnesses until March 2nd, 2007, that the 2-week break in March be used to formulate amendments, that the committee begin clause-by-clause consideration the week of March 19th, 2007, and that the committee report the bill back to the House no later than March 30th, 2007. At its organization meeting on December 14th, 2006, the committee adopted the following motion with respect to amendments: that amendments to Bill C30 be submitted to the clerk of the committee 48 hours prior to clause-by-clause consideration without limiting the ability to present additional amendments at the meeting itself. I take this to mean that members will make every effort to have all their amendments prepared and sent into the clerk so that comprehensive amendment packages can be compiled and distributed in advance of the first clause-by-clause meeting. Assuming that the committee wishes to begin clause-by-clause study on Monday, March 19th, this would mean that the amendments should be in the clerk's hands by Thursday, March 15th at 5 p.m. That's clear to all? Okay, if there is no further business, then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much. Have a good break.